Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final webinar in our trauma-informed series for Project Trust for 2021. Today, we're going to be talking about how we can best support LGBTQ plus individuals through direct services that are trauma-informed. For those of you who have never joined a Project Trust webinar, Project Trust is a national collaboration between the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, the Sinar Institute, and Brandeis University's Heller School for Social Policy and Management. Project Trust is a national program that's focused on providing trauma-informed training and technical assistance services to nonprofits and agencies on the ground working directly with individuals who may have experienced trauma and human trafficking situations. Today, during our training, we have a working agreement. The first is to maintain this safe space. We're going to be talking about a very nuanced population. We're all going to be learning together, and we can all talk about some strengths and challenges that we bring in serving this population. We have two amazing experts here today who are going to be taking us through some best practices and implementation, but we also want to be mindful that we can ask questions of these experts and really use this space to focus on our strengths individually and as a community serving these individuals. Before we get started, I'm going to pause and allow everyone to participate in a quick poll just for data collection purposes. Okay, about 10 seconds left to participate in the poll if you have not yet. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So before we jump into the content today, I just wanted to take a moment to remind everyone to practice self-care while learning. We're going to be talking about some really important things that really require your attention. So really make sure that you have things in your workspace that are going to help you concentrate on these best practices. Following the end of this webinar, please take some time to cultivate kindness towards yourself and towards your team, and really think about how you and your organization can best apply these practices. Today, our training objectives include identifying barriers to services for LGBTQ plus individuals with lived human trafficking experience. We'll also share some core principles of trauma-informed engagement for this population. And finally, we'll explore best practices to implementation of these core principles in direct service settings. Today, we have two subject matter experts. My name is Naja Martin. I am the Thrive Initiative's Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator at the Sinar Institute, and I work in hand with Project Trust. We also have Lindley Edges and Caden Ray. I'm going to pause and allow them to introduce themselves, starting with Lindley.
Thanks, Nasha. Hi, everyone. My name is Lindley Edges. I am currently the legal director at Transgender Law Center. I have been working in the anti-trafficking field for well over a decade at this point, initially at the Sex Workers Project at the Urban Justice Center and now at TLC. I do a lot of trainings for community members, for organizations as well as for law enforcement about working with trafficking survivors. And I specifically have a focus on working with LGBT trafficking survivors. And I started the first LGBT anti-trafficking program a number of years ago. I'm super excited to be here and looking forward to having a great conversation today.
Thank you so much, Lindley. And next we have Kaden Ray.
Hi, y'all. Yes, my name is Kaden Ray. My pronouns are they, them, and Faye Fair. I have been doing advocacy work for over 20 years, from working with teenagers who lived on streets on up to working in HIV, senior sexuality, and domestic and sexual violence, as well as human trafficking. One of the things that I'm just opened and became a part of is Here is My Closet. And what we do is we provide support and resources for LGBTQ employees and help businesses create programs to give support. And I'm really excited to be here and share with y'all today.
Thank you so much, Kaden. Okay, moving right along. We'll go ahead and start with barriers to anti-trafficking direct services for LGBTQ plus community members. Lindley will lead us through this. Thank you.
Thanks, Naja. And I also just want to say really quickly, there's a lot of expertise here. I've been doing this work for a very long time, Kaden as well as Naja as well, but I also know there's a lot of expertise in many of the people who are participating today, and I'm really grateful for that. And because of that, I also know that a lot of you are probably experts as well. So if there is something that comes up that I say that feels maybe not right, or you might have something to add, please feel free. This is how we learn. This is how we grow. And I am just really excited to talk about this because I talk about trafficking a lot. And it's great to be talking about it with a group of people who actually want to hear me talk, other than just my partner who has to hear about it all the time. Anyway, so once again, Lindley Edges, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And we can go to the next slide. Oh, and actually one last thing, I'm gonna try to speak slower. I know we have these outstanding ASL interpreters. If I start speaking too quickly, which happens, please just give me a wave, or, well, I don't think you can wave to me, but please put it in the chat box and I will try to talk a little bit slower. So doing this work in the anti-trafficking field, I've met with a lot of people who are always interested in identifying all and every trafficking survivor, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes just because they want to point to someone and say, I've seen a survivor of trafficking. And so when I think about when to do a screening for trafficking, I am very careful because we don't need to re-traumatize people. So in my mind, I always follow these couple of ideas about why it's important to identify someone as a trafficking survivor. Number one, that client might be in an unsafe situation and needs support leaving or safety planning. The client might have criminal convictions and they would like to vacate them. That's not available to all survivors of trafficking, but certain states do have laws that allow to vacate convictions for survivors of trafficking. New York State is one of them. We just passed an outstanding bill to help support that. The client might need support or want to report to law enforcement. A lot of trafficking survivors have had actually pretty negative experiences with law enforcement, so helping someone report could be the type of support they need as an attorney, as a social worker, or as a legal worker. So that's important. The client might not be a US citizen, and a T visa could be a good possibility. A T visa is a visa for someone who is a survivor of trafficking. Sometimes identification could be helpful for therapeutic reasons. I am not a therapist, but I've been grateful to actually have been trained by therapists and social workers. And so I do know that there are times where it is helpful to have an understanding of what someone's experience is to help guide what types of techniques to use. And the last is the eligibility for other civil remedies, like a civil case in court, to possibly get some money for all the work that people do without getting paid. And so I really just encourage people to hold on to those and not feel like we need to screen every single person for trafficking. You know, people will come to us with the issues that they're having, and we should be responsive to them and not responsive to what we think people need. Let's move to the next slide. So I get asked a lot, why are LGBTQ people vulnerable to trafficking? And that's a great question. And there are a lot of reasons why LGBTQ people are vulnerable to trafficking. Number one, some people in the community have experienced family rejection, and within that have been kicked out of their homes or forced to leave because of other types of institutional rejection or community rejection. So that is one thing. When people don't have a safe place to live, that makes them more vulnerable to people who could take advantage of them. Criminalization in a lot of different countries, as well in some ways in this country, being LGBT is criminalized, whether directly with laws that actually will put people to death for being LGBT, to laws that specifically target LGBT people, like walking while trans laws. This level of criminalization makes it more difficult for people to live their lives. And with criminal records, it makes it less likely that someone will be able to get a job that will allow them to support themselves. Discrimination. We see discrimination in a lot of different settings. One of those settings is the workplace, when LGBT people are unable to get jobs in certain economies. They often have to lead to street economies, which means that that type of work is sometimes criminalized or unregulated, and it makes people more vulnerable to trafficking. When someone is undocumented or has an immigration status that doesn't feel stable, that's something else that people can take advantage of, whether it's because they don't have work authorization or because they are they do have work authorization, but they're unable to get a job. It makes it more easy for a trafficker to be able to take advantage of them. Once again, lack of access to jobs. Criminalized occupations. I spoke about this a little earlier. It's really important to know that there are people who engage in sex work for a variety of reasons. Some people engage in sex work because it's what they want to do. Some people engage in sex work because it's the only job they can get. And some people are forced or coerced to engage in sex work. And when we're talking about that, we need to understand that at different points of people's lives, they can be engaging in sex work for different reasons or being in different places on that continuum. And that's a criminalized occupation. So even when people are forced or coerced to go engage in it, we still see people being criminalized. So, a good example, I'm a big believer in sharing case examples. I'm working on a case right now where my client was in a horrific trafficking situation, a trans woman, trans Latinx woman, and she was forced to engage in criminal activity, something around mail fraud. And the violence she experienced was quite extreme. And although this wasn't a criminalized occupation, it was connected to criminalization. And, because she was engaging in this behavior, her trafficker always threatened her with the police, with immigration. She finally got away from him, found her way to a domestic violence shelter, found the way to actually speak to the police and get a restraining order. But unfortunately, her trafficker called ICE, and ICE picked her up inside the courtroom while she was getting her restraining order. And because he was the one who called ICE, she ended up being criminalized and being, to some extent, having to take all of the blame for the situation, even though it was very clear she was being abused. But because she was engaging in criminal activity, her trafficker, who was able to pretty much run free, while she was the person who was sentenced to 10 years in jail. So it's really important to look at the types of work that people are coerced or forced into, some legal work and some not legal work. And I just raised that case up, because I think we all know that traffickers call ICE sometimes. We all know ICE is not supposed to pick people up while they're getting orders, restraining orders. And we also know that ICE isn't supposed to be listening to people who are traffickers or abusers. But we also know that things don't always work out that way. And that is a case I'm currently working on. So it's just important to keep in mind that when we look at the criminalized occupations and the criminalization and what people are forced or coerced into, it is sometimes victims who we see as victims initially are turned into the perpetrator by the trafficker. And that makes people LGBT people specifically even more vulnerable to trafficking, because it's important to remember that everything that we're talking about, being LGBTQ, is layered into it. So it's not just a white cis young girl who's being trafficked. We're talking about a transgender Latinx person. So any type of feelings or biases people have against Latinx people, against immigrants, and against trans people fully came into play in this woman's case. And now she is, well, being abused in jail. But so it's important to remember that everything I'm talking about here is layered even further for LGBTQ people, because as we look at this could be trafficking for anybody about why people are vulnerable, but it just makes it more intense. So I'm going to continue. The other issues are inability to access safe services, inability to report crimes and be believed. That was a very specific case with my client. She was initially believed, but once her trafficker blamed her for all of the mail fraud, even though it was clear it wasn't her fault, they chose to believe him. And the other big issue is the lack of access to accurate identity documents. It's so important that people have identity documents that reflect who they are as people and have their gender markers correct and have their name correct. And when people don't have access to those documents, it makes it much harder to be able to access jobs because someone might be outing themselves fairly often. And so we need to ensure that people have accurate identity documents and they're able to use their true name and their true gender on all of those documents in order to not be as vulnerable to trafficking. Next slide. And I'm just going to take a look to see if I missed anything. Okay, I didn't, no questions yet. Talking a little bit about youth, I think it's important to talk about youth, LGBT youth. I do think that the conversation about LGBT youth is a little, people sometimes want to focus only on LGBTQ youth and not understand that this also impacts adults. So I do think it's important because a lot of the factors that occur in childhood also lead to vulnerability in adulthood, as well as the fact that a lot of LGBT people are trafficked more than once in their life. So I've already discussed a lot around the family rejection. It's also important to note that LGBTQ youth in juvenile detention, they're twice as likely to be removed from their homes because someone was hurting them. They're twice as likely to have been detained in juvenile detention for running away from a home replacement. It's important to take a moment. Why are people running away from a home replacement? Well, probably because it's unsafe. And the other thing I just want to raise right now is we're talking about specifically LGBTQ, but when we add in the racism, ableism, and anti-Blackness that are so prevalent in all of our systems, all of these factors and all of these statistics change pretty extremely when we're talking specifically about LGBTQ youth of color, and it is definitely more than twice as likely. It is incredibly higher. And sometimes we don't get those statistics, but it is important for us to acknowledge that due to the racism, anti-Blackness, and ableism that exist, that LGBT youth of color face even more vulnerabilities to human trafficking. Next slide, please. LGBTQ youth face a lot of vulnerability in educational settings. Prior to becoming a lawyer, I was an organizer at GLSEN, Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And the violence and harassment LGBTQ youth face is real. I had a case where someone I worked with, one of the young people, I was fighting to make sure that my client, that his teacher wasn't calling him the F word in front of the entire class. And this was actually a fight because it seemed acceptable by certain people at that time. So the verbal harassment and often physical harassment is not always just students. It's often we see teachers, we see social workers, and we see principals doing this too. And when someone doesn't feel safe in school, are they going to go back? Does it even make sense to go back? Many of us have do a lot of work around harm reduction. If someone is in an unsafe situation, harm reduction wise, does it make sense for that young person to go back to school? So it's important for us to keep that in mind and fighting for safer schools for all students. Next slide. So There are a lot of homeless LGBT youth and LGBT youth in foster care. LGBTQ youth are disproportionately represented in youth shelters. When this study was done, which I believe was 2015, there were 40% of homeless youth population identified as LGBTQ. I'd worked a lot with LGBTQ youth in my legal career as well as at my time at GLSEN, and I never fully understood how beds in youth shelters worked, because there'd be 20 beds and there'd be a line out the door of young people who can't access those beds. And so what I saw with young people I worked with is if there was no spot for them to sleep, that they ended up sleeping in parks, they ended up sleeping in places that were unsafe. And they ended up being taken advantage of or trading sex because that was their way of having a place to stay at night. That's all of those things can create more of a criminalization and convictions on someone's record. And I know some of you might be thinking, but it's juvenile detention, it's not any better. Sometimes we see young people charged as an adult anyway. We touched on this a little bit earlier, that youth in foster care, LGBT youth in foster care experience high rates of disruptive placements. Some youth, actually LGBTQ youth, have to hide their identity in order to stay safe. And nearly 1 in 5 foster care youth identify as LGBTQ. Now let's actually take a moment for that one to really sink in. And this is an older statistic, so we know it is probably higher at this point. We don't know how many LGBTQ people are youth in this country, but think about that. 1 in 5 youth identify as LGBTQ in the foster care system. That is incredibly high compared to non-LGBTQ youth are there, especially with the number of LGBTQ youth who are out in the United States these days. Homelessness and foster care are big drivers into human trafficking. I had a client a number of years ago who was living in a shelter, and the traffickers would actually just hang out outside the shelter and just see who was interested. And that's actually how those traffickers found victims, because not everyone, once again I said, had beds, and sometimes the shelters weren't even safe places either. So it can become a funnel into trafficking. Next slide. So there are many LGBT youth who engage, well, not many, there are LGBTQ youth who engage in survival sex. And when I say survival sex, I mean they're engaging in sex work in order to survive. So they are trading sex for food, shelter, clothing, money, drugs, other necessities, medical care. Medical care is a huge one. And they're doing this because their needs are not being met either at home, in foster care, by the medical system. And so this is their only way of actually being able to care for themselves. And so it's really important to remember that we know that 50% of youth who are trading sex are doing it because they did not have a place to stay that night and wouldn't have done so if they had an alternative option for shelter. I think it's also important to remember that under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, anyone who is younger than 18 engaging in commercial sex is deemed a trafficking victim. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. Coercion, force, or fraud is not required here. You just have to be younger than 18. It's important to remember this because even though under the federal law, young people who are engaging in commercial sex who are younger than 18 are victims, they are still being arrested, put in juvenile detention, sometimes being put in jail because they traded sex to survive. So they're deemed a victim in one place. In certain places, they're not even old enough to consent to sex, but they're actually being criminalized as the victim in this case. So I just think it's important to kind of work our way around how weird that is. So next slide. And the study that I'm referring to, by the way, and I should have mentioned this, is Surviving the Streets of New York. It was done in February 2015. Meredith Bank, I think, was one of the main researchers. Outstanding study, first of its kind. But it showed us a lot of different things. And one of the big ones was that LGBTQ youth engage in survival sex because they're unable to access services because of institutional barriers. They're denied services, getting services unsafe. They're treated badly by staff members, or they're outed by staff members. So it's really important to really take a moment and see how the work we do is creating these barriers for LGBTQ youth to engage in services that they need, they deserve, and that they're entitled to. Next slide. According to this study, 72% of the young people wanted to stop engaging in survival sex. They just didn't have any other options. So what does that say about our society? It basically says that we are not creating systems that allow young people to meet their needs, and that we need to be doing better. Next slide, please. I like to talk about trafficking cycles. When I started doing this work, I don't know how many years ago, I started doing screenings for my clients for immigration purposes, and I worked with a lot of trans women. And I called up an assistant U.S. attorney about a case I had, and she outstanding U.S. attorney. I'd worked with her before, very very victim centered. And I said, I have a trans client who's a victim of trafficking, and she said, I've never heard of a transgender person being a survivor of trafficking. And I was like, oh, okay. And she didn't mean it in a negative way. She just honestly had never heard of that. She never had someone bring a transgender person who was a survivor of trafficking to her office. And that's one of the reasons why I have seen so many trans women go into cycles of trafficking, often 3 to 5 times in their lifetime. And that cycle doesn't get broken, oftentimes because there's no safety net. The police are not an option to ask for help. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. And sometimes people don't always realize what's happening to them is against the law. I hear that a lot. The other issue is that sometimes the abuse that they're experiencing in trafficking situations is not the worst abuse they've experienced in their life. And that this might be a better situation than they have been in. And I've been told that a lot. So it's important for us to remember what the systems and the situations that are allowing for trafficking cycles to keep going, and the difference. I've worked with a lot of non-LGBT trafficking survivors, and I have never seen these cycles. And I'll be honest, I probably worked with, I don't know, 500, 700 trafficking survivors, at least screening them over the years. And I've never seen those types of cycles in the same way. So it's really important for us to dig in about why it is more difficult for LGBT, specifically trans women, to leave trafficking situations and not be re-trafficked. One of the things that I have seen that has worked is when there is community intervention and community who's working with community. A former colleague of mine and a dear, dear friend and a mentor who passed away at the very beginning of COVID. Her name was Lorena Borjas, and she used to do night outreach to people doing trans women and LGBT youth, and really anyone on the streets, providing them with food, condoms, anything people needed as a way to stay safe. She also offered, a listening ear and coffee. And she would also be the person who would create spaces for people to come to, support groups, access to Oops, I'm going over my time. Okay, real quick. She also offered access to safe spaces. She took people in. And it was because of that that I saw so many people, so many trans women who had been in these cycles actually be able to end those cycles because they finally had a safety net. They finally had someone to ask for help and they had a place to live. So I think that's just really important. And I always like to raise up her amazing work. Next one, and I will be quick. We've talked a lot about this. Why aren't we identifying LGBT trafficking survivors? Well, one, sometimes people don't even know that LGBT people could be trafficking survivors, except maybe with youth. There's also a lot of barriers with law enforcement when LGBTQ victims reach out for help. Organizations might not be LGBTQ friendly. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but screening problems. Minimization, normalization, and trafficking might not be the worst part of their lives are so normal that if people don't know how to actually screen well LGBTQ people or just trafficking in general, you will not find trafficking. I've actually used some of the trafficking guides that were created and none of my clients would have popped on those. It's actually why we are about to release a LGBTQ trafficking red flag guide in January. Bias and stereotype. Once again, there's no trafficking in LGBT communities, and all trans people want to do sex work is another bias and stereotype that people have. Next slide. I'm going to be honest, people experience really bad things when they report crimes to the police. A lot of my clients in New York had been raped by police officers who were on duty, who had been beaten up, beaten so bad that their breast implants popped. I've even tried to have my clients report to NYPD, and my client experienced horrific transphobia and just undercutting of everything she said. And I was just blatantly told she wasn't a victim, even though the trafficking started when she was 16 years old, and they refused to take a police report. It was pretty bad. I will say, though, that even though these are sometimes the feelings people hold on to, there are really good, I've worked with good law enforcement officials at the FBI in New York, so I just want to raise that up, that there are good people to report to, but due to the past experiences of such horrific police misconduct, it takes a while to get someone to feel safe. Next slide. As I said, people are not believed. They may be arrested. I had one client one time who had been a trans woman who had been raped, who the officer didn't realize that she was trans. And once he realized she was trans, he started making announcements about her genitals very loudly. This was the SVU unit of the police. He then went and told her friend, "Don't you know she's really a man?" He then made a comment that, you know, she was clearly doing sex work by choice because she had all of these ads up. It was a really horrific and shaming experience for her. She was treated incredibly disrespectfully. The irony that he didn't know was she was a trafficking victim. Those ads were put up by her trafficker and she was cooperating in a federal investigation. But that's what people experience, what my clients have experienced with the police in New York. Next slide, please. Oh, I made it. Okay, let's keep going. The next slide, please. So just a big thank you right now to Naja, who put together these beautiful, beautiful slides. I just sent over some information and now they look just outstanding. So we're going to go over some core principles of trauma-informed engagement with LGBTQ individuals impacted by trafficking. And the first is talking about practicing a non-judgmental approach. The second is be aware of situational nuance, inquire politely, use person-centered and gender-affirming language, and create gender-affirming spaces. Next slide. Sex work is not the only thing LGBT people are trafficked into. I have had clients trafficked in, I've had LGBTQ clients trafficked into so many different forms of labor, some criminalized, some not. And we also know that the majority of trafficking that happens is not into commercial sex. But when we are talking about sex work, it's so important that we stay non-judgmental around sex work. And that's because, like, even if you have an issue around sex work, other people might not. And someone who might be a trafficking survivor may have been engaging in sex work by choice at different points of their life, or not understood that they were actually in a coercive situation. So for example, someone who was choosing to work in a brothel because that felt safer, and once they're in a brothel, it became a coercive and violent situation. And I had clients say, well, even though I couldn't leave, it was still my fault because I went to work there. And I said, well, that's not how trafficking works, but I understand why you feel that way. So it's really important for us to stay non-judgmental. We all have different feelings about sex and our bodies and what's okay and what we want to happen to our bodies. We need to make sure that we don't put those feelings on other people. Sex work may have been the first time a person felt positive reinforcement about their body or their sexual orientation. Clients might have felt that this was their only option for employment. And when we shame people, it means they don't come back, or they feel bad, or they're less likely to be truthful. And that's on us. That's our fault if we do that poorly. And if we do that poorly, if we do make that mistake, it is so important for us to apologize, take accountability with that client. So I always say, please stay non-judgmental about sex work. Also, in general, I worked at a place called the Sex Workers Project. I often got asked by the law enforcement I did work with how we ended up with so many clients. And I said, because we're not asking people to identify as trafficking victims to walk in the door. We're just asking people to walk in who have traded sex at some point in their life and they're eligible for services. So we're creating as low barrier as possible to serve and reach the people who want our support. Next slide. Nuance. Be very aware of nuances to LGBTQ and trafficking. We are getting to a better space where we are understanding that intimate partner violence can lead to trafficking, but it is not everywhere. I'm working on a case right now in Tennessee where a Black trans woman is being charged with murdering her trafficker because it was a domestic violence situation, and the police couldn't understand how that could lead to trafficking, and also do not believe she was trafficked because she is a Black trans woman. I think what the quote from that prosecutor was, "There's no expert in the world you could bring me to show me that she was a trafficking victim." It's a bit of an odd case because it's all caught on tape and you watch her getting beaten and her just trying to get away, but they still charged her with murder. So it's really important for us to actually have an understanding that sometimes intimate partner violence can lead to trafficking. There's also a normalization of intimate partner violence. When people have experienced it for large parts of their life and people feel like it's normal, that's important. And that is really important when we are screening for trafficking, once again, because there's a reason to, but it's really important for us to ask very specific questions like, did anyone ever threaten to call immigration on you? Well, of course someone, and I get this all the time. Well, of course someone did this. That happens all the time. That's normal. And that might be normal for that person, but that's actually also coercion, right? We know that that can be coercion. And when someone has experienced intimate partner violence that might have been worse in other situations, it's even more important that when there's a trafficking situation that we need to identify, that we get very specific about questions and really stay non-judgmental and understand the nuances there. LGBTQ people in general, as well as all people, minimize their experience as a way to cope. A lot of LGBTQ people feel like they will not be believed because they actually have tried asking for help before and they were not believed. I was once in a situation actually with my colleague Lorena at a group meeting, and she brought a young boy. He was maybe 11, and I didn't know what he wanted. And I was like, well, who is this, Lorena? And she said, he wants to talk to you. He needs to talk to you. And the kid was like, I don't want to talk. And Lorena was like, no, you can trust her. And he looked at me and he's just like, why? It's not like you're going to believe me. No one ever has. And it was a heartbreaking moment because I would have believed him, but he really felt that I wouldn't have. And I didn't have someone vouching for me that I was someone safe to report to. I have no idea what would have happened, but I'm so grateful for the work that Lorena did, as well as so many other community members to create those safe spaces. the last thing I want to I know I've said this before, but it's so important. The trafficking experience might not be the worst experience of their lives. I once had a client ask me why I was asking so much about intimate partner violence in the United States that led her into being coerced and forced into sex work, when the violence she experienced in her home country was, in her mind, so much worse. And I had to explain that we could focus on a T visa for this. And that was just confusing to her, which also meant that she didn't bring it up until a little bit later. So it's important for us to remember that and not make people feel like it should have been the worst experience. We need people to hold on to that. Also, it's important for us to hold the nuance that just because someone was violent and someone was coercive and forced someone to engage in any type of labor, that doesn't mean that that client still doesn't love them, still wouldn't go back to them the next day if they could, or still doesn't hold some type of warm feelings. So it's important for us to have that understanding that in certain situations, those types of dynamics are created to make it feel like someone would want to go back to them. And that's actually normal in any type of intimate partner violence relationship, not just LGBTQ, but I've seen it a lot with LGBTQ people. Next slide, please. If you have to ask questions about people's medical histories or personal questions, make sure you really need to ask. And I always do for all my questions. I ask my clients, I ask myself, is this something I need to know, or is this something I want to know? How is this going to help my client? Is there a reason I need to know if my client has had any types of surgeries? There could be. I've had many clients who had their trafficker force them to have surgery, or force them to go through procedures. So it is actually important that I know what those are. But if that's not there, there's no reason as an attorney and often as a social worker for us to be asking questions about people's genitals, about people's experiences with certain types of medication, experiences with healthcare, or anything that probably would not be the best thing for you to be asked yourself. It's also never okay to ask to see someone's genitals or their breasts or their chest. I raised this up. I did a training for the U.S. Attorney's Office, and this was the piece that the AUSA I was working with held on to and repeated in many trainings we had together. And I say that because that has happened. It happens often. So please remember, please do not ask to see anyone's body parts. I can't imagine a situation where any of us on this call would find that appropriate, unless you're a medical provider and it's relevant. Okay, next slide. Gender neutral language for organizations. It's important to use, it's really important to use the language that our clients use, and to make sure that we're really inclusive when we're talking about clients and survivors, because by putting that forward and not perpetuating gender stereotypes, it's going to make people feel safer. So we need to put it into practice with all of the work we do. Because if we're just doing it with LGBT clients, we might be missing it with other clients, but then we're also kind of being a little tokenizing. So it's important to create these types of safe spaces. Next slide. And what is a gender affirming safe space? I love this picture, by the way. An environment, what is a gender affirming safe space? It's a place where people feel safe and they can be their authentic selves. It's about having restrooms where people can go into the restroom that they feel most comfortable in. And there's also a gender neutral restroom, that waiting rooms are safe, that changing rooms are safe, that the forms that we ask people to say are also safe. It makes a difference. It's also important to not just put pictures on the wall, but to follow through with all of these things, to actually be genuine about doing this work. But representation is important. I had a case where I guess it was June, where I was taking a client to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District, and she was really nervous, trans woman, trans Latinx woman, and she saw this picture of, I don't even know who it was, but it was like, we welcome LGBTQ people. It was for Pride Month. It was very nice. And she told me after that relaxed her so fast because she felt like she would be accepted there. And when the AUSA was very clear and knew that my client identified as a woman and said, if you need to use the women's bathroom, it's right over here. I'm not on video, so you can't see my hand gestures, but that is what I'm doing. And making it clear that we know it's safe for people to use certain bathrooms. Next slide. Oh, and I'm done. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Lindley, for that great explanation of those best practices and some of the barriers that folks in this community face on a regular basis. I saw some really great comments in the chat. I'm so happy that folks are finding this information to be so useful. Now that we have an understanding of some of these barriers and practices, let's move forward to talk about how we can implement these practices and these principles within our anti-trafficking direct services. I'll go ahead and hand it over to Kaden to take us out.
Hi, y'all. So thank you, Lindley, for such a great way of setting the table for trauma-informed services. Oh, next slide, please. We're moving into this section, and as we go through this section, I want you to take in what we talked and what Lindley talked about and shared in her stories and in her stats and in her experience, and have these questions in the back of your head as we move forward. Think about what this would look like in your organization or whatever type of work you do, how we can tell whether we're inclusive of all genders, what concerns you might have, and why do you want trauma-informed services? It's very a buzzword for some that we're trauma-informed, but what does that mean? And trauma-informed for one organization or one type of field is different than others. So as we're moving through, I want you to keep these in the back of your mind. Next slide, please. I'm going to tell you that it can be overwhelming thinking, how can we make a change? How can things happen? How can we move forward? But making change can happen, and it can happen one conversation at a time. Years ago, I was working with someone and in the HIV world, and he was in Michigan and I was out here, and he wanted to start something where the stigma of going to get tested wasn't a big deal. So it was called Mr. Friendly. It was positive or negative, I'm here for you. And it was just one conversation at a time. We started here, I'm in New Jersey, we started a pilot program for getting people to go out into bars and places and do outreach and say, hey, you want to get tested? I'll go with you. And now it's an international organization. So it can happen, but the premise of this was just one conversation at a time. And so what we're doing right now is we're having a conversation. Next slide, please. So 4 considerations for our stakeholders who are working with the LGBTQ plus population. Now, this population is found in all sorts of communities, regardless of religion, regardless of your socioeconomics, regardless of where you came from. But within the LGBTQ population, these considerations are things that come out in the back of people's heads. It's what forms policy. It's what forms our history. When I say our, I'm part of the community myself. And what happens is people will have these things in the back of their head. They're just not named. People will wonder what type of sex you're having. Like, you say you're a queer person, what type of sex are you having? People will wonder what bathroom you should use and what your genitals look like. But it's also one of the only populations who continually need to out themselves throughout their lifetime. And when I say need, in order to get services that are conducive to who they are, or having relationships. Yes, some people do not out themselves, and unfortunately, sometimes that leads to health disparities and other things throughout their lifetime. Next slide, please. So additional barriers for stakeholders when reaching this population. So many of us go or attend webinars or go to trainings, and we get some great information, but then we don't know what to do with it. Maybe it's overwhelming. There's just so much. Like, we got some great stuff from Lindley earlier, Maybe you're not a decision maker in your organization. You're not someone who can say, yes, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. Funding challenges, maybe if you're, especially if you're working in grant type of work, that this doesn't line up with what your grant or how you're supposed to say things. Oftentimes in our organizations, even within our organizations, we can work in silos in what we do, and we're not necessarily knowing what's happening out through an organization. And then there's a lack of application of being able to apply what we do. So in some ways, a barrier is our own organization in how we move forward in our work. Next slide, please. So I have this this worksheet that you have this link to this paper. So I create programs for organizations and help them look at what they're doing. And I created one for this webinar today. Creating safer places for LGBTQ plus individuals with lived human trafficking experience. I use the word, instead of saying a safe place, I use safer, because safer is actionable. What may feel safe, if you feel that your place is safe, it may not feel safe for someone else. So saying, hey, this is a safe place may not work for them, but it could be a safer place than the place where they're at. So when we're looking at this sheet, and I'm not going to go through the entire sheet, but when we're looking at this, I broke it down into task, resources, challenges, starting point, and who to send. Now, if you're somebody on this call, again, as we've gone through and I spoke about trauma-informed services and thinking about how we do and what to supply, and I've talked about the barriers, think about the stuff that Lindley says, and you can take something like this sheet and print it out and kind of go through and see what resources do you have, what challenges, who could you send this to, who maybe you're not an executive director or somebody higher up, but you can come and show some different ideas on how to move forward. Now, when I do talk about things like deciding on LGBTQ plus, recognizing that for some people, queer is can be very triggering. So using and explaining how you use the different terms is really important. Again, it's divided up into assessing and evaluating your language, evaluating, updating, or creating your resources. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these as we go on. We also have access and integrate LGBT needs into the physical spaces, and we're going to talk more a little bit about what those look like. So if you have this, if you're able to print it out or you want to make some notes as we go, then you can just fill out this as we go along. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we talk about are bathrooms, and it is the best practice to have gender neutral restrooms. If somebody says, where's the bathroom? You can just say it's down the hall, second on door on the right. And it can just say bathroom. Making sure that in your bathrooms, everything that anybody needs for any kind of people who bleed, being able to have those kind of products in all the bathrooms is really important. You shouldn't require ID for people to come in because, again, as Lindley said, it can be very hard for some people who have legal your legal name versus your the name of who you are. I will completely say that I've been Caden for about 2 months now, and it is a challenge when I have to pull out my legal license. I am in the process of changing my name, and I am very fortunate to have those resources, but many people do not have those type of resources. Next slide, please. So the thing about intake forms is they're an introduction when somebody looks at these intake forms as to what an agency cares about. It's also a living document. It's something that can be changed and it can be used. And it's also a gateway to healthy direct services. When somebody looks at an intake form and they just see male or female on there, they don't see themselves or an option. One great way to do your intake forms is to say gender and just leave that space blank and let them self-identify whatever it is on your forms that they feel comfortable. Leaving that blank place gives them an option to see that you're open to others. Now, one of the pushbacks that I've had when I've talked about intake forms is people will say, well, when I'm trying to make the data collection for this, I don't know what to do. If they put gender queer, I don't know what to say. Well, if on your data collection stuff, it says male, female, trans woman, trans man, but it doesn't say gender queer, but there's something that says other, it's okay to put that in your data. That's one way to go about in making your intakes forms more inclusive. Next slide, please. Using wording that's simplistic as possible. Remembering that some people don't have the education levels or reading levels, so that's a reason you want to make it easily read and giving space in between. So especially because some people have eyesight issues, or maybe they are have some mental health stuff going on, and it can be overwhelming seeing too much. Again, explain the reason why you want certain information, because that otherwise it can sound like you're trying to give them an interrogation about who they are as a person. Next slide, please. So trauma-informed intake forms, you can just put legal and then put a place for legal name or preferred name. And also, anytime somebody's coming in, even if they've come in once, then the next time you can ask them again. When I was working in HIV, I worked with several sex workers, and they would come in, and every time I would ask them, what would you like to be called today? And this one person said, I want to be called Sparkle. And I said, all right, you know what? I want to be called Glitter. And that's how we worked and interacted with each other. And knowing that they had a place that they got to be themselves in that one space, knowing that when they went back out in the world, they didn't get to have that word for themselves is very important. Next slide, please. So again, Lindley talked more about the talking and writing about gender affirming language and why it is so very important. It's critical to use those names, pronouns, salutations, and gendered language. It's also critical to ask them if it's okay that you use that with someone else. How comfortable do they feel in asking in anybody else, even throughout your own agency, knowing any of these things about them? It's very important. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about gender neutral closets and waiting rooms, so some places have places where people, when they come in and they can go and get clothes in closets, and some places they'll put the men's stuff in one space and the women's stuff in another space, or what they define as men and women. Really, if you just put everything together, maybe sort it by size or color, and they get the option to go in and pick, it keeps the attention towards what a person's choosing and wants to wear and what matters to them. And it gives them a place just to start with their own agency of themselves and their own expression of who they are. It doesn't denote gender expression and what on the binary that needs to be. Also, using a bag or a basket for privacy so they can pick things up. Now, what are some products that maybe LGBTQ plus survivors could maybe looking to access, or maybe they haven't had proper access to? For instance, binders. Some people will tape their chest flat, or use different types of like sports tape, and that can be very detrimental. But having things like a binder where they can make a choice to put something on if they want to and feel comfortable. Also, stand to urinate devices. They can even be found in like hiking stores like REI. I personally have my own. I had that for hiking, but now I use that as my preference. And it does give some affirming of who you are. Having packies or penile prosthetics, wigs, gaffing materials, shaving, plucking tools, the hip forms, or other kind of prosthetics like makeup or whatever. Why would you want these for them? It gives them a chance to be who they are, and it gives people a chance to live safely in who they are. Next slide, please.
Really quickly, Kaden, I'm just going to add on here. When we're able to affirm these individuals and provide these really safe spaces, we're also able to build this relationship where they feel much better telling someone about their trafficking experience and leaning into the services. So really trying to create that safe space just through some of these tools can ultimately be really helpful for their case or for their case management services.
And when they're freely able to go in and get these things and use these things, they start to feel a freedom in themselves.
Absolutely.
And they get a chance to, in that freedom, they can start to take down some of those barriers. Because as Lindley said, for some of them, the human sex trafficking experience really isn't the bad part of their life, right? But if they can start to feel safe and freedom in who they are, they can start to work on some of the things that have been hard and bad for them. Next slide, please. So we don't just add a T to the LGBT. We're not going in a big, an expansive thing about gender and whatnot. I'm sure there's of course many out there, but it is important that you do the critical work to make your place trans, inclusive, and responsive. Sometimes what happens is we see something, we hear that we're going to fix this, and we get reactive to what we think is needed rather than responsive to the actual lived experience of someone. Making organizational towards trans inclusion and the provision of trans and services, and doing that across the board for your employees, because you never know who in your own organization may be in trans, and train all of your staff and use the language. Do it purposely, intentionally, and with attention. Examine your institutional assumptions about trans identities, what people should look like, how they should be, and remember to challenge transphobia when you hear or see it. I've worked in programs before. I was the LGBT domestic violence task force chair for New Jersey for a while, and I had people come to me and say that they were in a shelter and they were going to be forced to show their genitals to prove that they were a woman to be in a service. Respect the ways trans people refer to themselves, whatever that feels like, because again, it's part of who they are. It's not something that they've made up in their heads. Thank you for that. Next slide. So I think this is Lindley's.
Lindley, do you want to take this last slide?
Sure, yeah, awesome. Absolutely, thank you. So, we talked a lot about trafficking, about what we can do, how we can work with people. And sometimes we kind of miss the how do we end the cycle of trafficking. I'm a big believer in, doing anti-trafficking work is also doing anti-poverty work. So we need to look at what people need in order to get them out of coercive and violent situations. And one of the biggest things that I hear is, I don't have a place to live. I need a house, or I need help getting out of those situations. So it's important for us to look at those safety net situations and see if they're LGBTQ friendly, see if those resources are needed and what resources. And within that, it's also really important to talk to community, not necessarily just like if you want to have an actual relationship with I'll just say trans Latinx community in Queens, in New York, you actually have to have that relationship. You have to do the work. What you might think is needed might not be. And I'm going to take 3 minutes and tell a story because I tell stories. A number of years ago, well over 10 years ago, we were getting a lot of feedback that trans women were experiencing police violence in Queens. And we decided as attorneys and as a couple of social workers that what the community actually needed was know your rights trainings. We did a lot of work on this beautiful resource, and we got there to present the resource to this large community group. And it was very clear that's not what people needed. And we didn't know because we didn't ask. We didn't take the moment to say, what's going on here? How can we support you? And what will that look like? Because you all have been living here for a long time. and probably have your own safety mechanisms, and maybe you need space just to share them with each other. Maybe you need to find law enforcement that's actually friendly to report to, or maybe you need to figure out how to specifically have people show up in court when members of this community are arrested. And so,
Lindley, you're cutting out a little bit, just an FYI.
Sorry, everyone. So just, I really strongly encourage, if you're going to do this work, show up, create the safe places to report crimes. I spoke about my bad experiences with the NYPD. I had been working with the FBI on other cases. I said, I'd love to bring you some cases, but I don't think you've worked with LGBT people. And that unit said, come train me. And I did, and they're outstanding. And I can't speak highly enough of those agents. Make sure that you have legal services and criminal legal services and job placement. Really making sure that the place is safe and actually working with community to create that is what's going to end those cycles. Because people have been taking care of themselves for a long time because a lot of these safety net programs haven't been working. So sometimes it makes more sense just to fund those programs that have been going unfunded. So that is my how to end some of the trafficking cycles.
I would also add that different states have resources that we don't even know about, right? So like in our state, we have an LGBT state liaison and liaison law enforcement program. And in our county, I am in Monmouth County, we have one. Different places, there's probably over 269 now towns have what's going on. We're doing a pilot program here in Monmouth County where there'll be stickers in different stores in towns where a person can go to see this sticker because they don't want to go to a police station, and it's going to be a safe place sticker. And when they go, they're able to get in touch with law enforcement, and an LGBT liaison will come to them. So there's different ways that things are coming up. And as Lindley talked about, going in and doing education and partnering with our immigration services, partnering with our criminal services and other safe houses, and talking to them about what the importance is, because sometimes they just really don't know. So thank you for that.
And I just wanted to add a couple of things, because I get these questions a lot around IDs, especially sometimes from law enforcement as well as from legal organizations. How can my clients have to show IDs. That's the only way they're going to get up to see me. This is the protocol. Take a moment to really think about ways to fix that protocol, because there are reasons for it. And that's okay, but maybe you could give the names of people prior to them coming. You can tell the people at the front desk to go down and pick them up, but really taking some time to brainstorm changes so that, understanding that these protocols are put in place, but there are ways that we can ensure that the protocols are kept in place in certain ways, but that it is really safe for us to ensure that people can get services. And one other thing, when we talk about pronouns, when we talk about bathrooms, when we interview people, everyone makes mistakes all the time. We can do our best, and we should try to do our best, but mistakes happen. When mistakes happen, it is so important to apologize, acknowledge it, and then move on and do better. It's not great to continuously apologize over and over again. It's not okay just to ignore it. But by actually apologizing and being genuine about it and trying to do better, you're going to build such an amazing relationship with that person. Because I've worked with a lot of people someone who's a lawyer had never apologized for a mistake that they made. So, you're not going to be perfect with pronouns all the time. You should try, but it's probably not going to happen. So just making sure that you take that time, because none of us are perfect. We're all works in progress. And clearly, if you're here, you want to learn something. So unless you're getting CLEs for it, which I don't think you are, because I'm not. So so all of that being said, that was my last statement.
So yeah, like making change, it's ongoing. What's working for now may not work later. It's fluctuating. You don't, it comes and goes in in cycles. And as Lindley pointed out, it's full of trial and error. You're gonna make mistakes. It's what you do with those mistakes that count. And it is possible through work and cooperation and talking, and again, having one conversation at a time.
Thank you so much, Lindley and Kaden. This has been incredibly helpful and hopefully very impactful in the work that all of our attendees are going to be doing. I'm going to go ahead and pause to allow any last questions that folks have before we go ahead and wrap up this webinar. I don't see anything in there now, but if anyone has any final questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat. I'll pause for about a minute or so. Amanda asked if you can get copies of the slides. I will be posting the recording of this webinar and the handouts on the Project Trust website about next week or so. You will all also receive a follow-up email from me, which will include the survey to provide feedback, the handout, and a link to the webinar. But unfortunately, no physical copies will be provided. Thank you so much for all of the amazing comments in the chat. We are so happy that this webinar has been helpful and will empower all of you as stakeholders to provide mindful, trauma-informed, and fantastic services to all of the individuals in your care and who might soon be in your care. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you all again in the new year.